Okay, so this is the previous lecture we had was about the immune system, viruses and bacteria. We are going to skip the fickle finger here, so since this is a virtual setting, so let me get past that. Alright, it'll be interesting to see how this works. Okay, so today we're talking about vaccines and disease prevention. So to begin with that, let's talk a little bit about history. So you need to know how this began with the smallpox vaccine. It was the first one quite some time ago, how all vaccines work today. We'll talk a little bit about polio because that's a great example of a success story we have. And then we'll answer some questions about the safety of vaccines. Are they related to autism and a variety of other concerns that many parents have? But first, let's talk about smallpox. So smallpox is a virus that's transmitted in droplets of saliva through contamination. A lot of times this was, from clothing and things, but it thankfully isn't much of an issue anymore. But this is a good thing because, as you can see, this is a pretty nasty disease. Now, this was a lucky person because they're by day 46. Here you can see that they recovered after being covered with many of these pox. A pox, is just a sore. You've heard of chicken pox. A lot of times the name of the pox is given for the origin of the disease. Chicken pox originated with chickens. There's things like monkeypox, and smallpox is small, so hence the name. Alright, so how did all this begin? Well, it used to be this was a major problem, smallpox. It was quite an epidemic, especially in England back in the 1790s. So imagine, here's this doctor, Dr. Edward Jenner, and like so many scientists and researchers, he's using the scientific method. He may not really be, thinking it through in the steps that we've assigned it. But so he noticed something, and that is that, smallpox was very widespread. It's a major problem that a lot of people were coming in sick with, and many were dying. But there was a group of people that never seemed to get sick. And these were the dairymaids. Now, we're not really familiar with what a dairymaid is, but these would be the women that would milk cows. Okay, and so, and it was primarily women that would do this, and this was primarily what they would do. Now, he also noticed along with this something that was a little unique, and that was that the cows had a seemingly related disease that was called cowpox, and they had these smallpox-looking pox on the udders that that the dairymaids would be in contact with when they were milking the cows. And so he wondered if there might be something in that would then protect them from smallpox later. Now, this was kind of a revolutionary thought. It kind of makes sense to us today, but at the time this would have been very revolutionary. So he tested this in a rather unorthodox way. It would not fly today, but at the time he basically would scrape out the pus-filled sores from the cows, from the cowpox, and take that pus, which of course would have had in bacteria and viruses and who knows whatever. In this case, he's concerned about the viruses, though at the time they didn't even know what a virus was. But he would take that pus and he would basically scrape it into, in this case, his children and his friends and things like that to see, well, what would happen. And they got a little irritation at the point where they scraped it in, as you would expect. But nothing really came of it. They didn't get sick because cowpox is a disease that affects cows, not people. So it didn't actually cause any outbreak on the people. But what he noticed was that people that had had this inoculation, which is what it became to be known as, didn't get smallpox. And over enough time and with enough trials of this, he began to see that this is in fact a pattern, that exposure to cowpox does seem to offer some protection against smallpox. So he published his findings, as all good scientists do, in a peer-reviewed journal, even way back when, in 1798. And it's been done very similar ever since then. Now, we actually don't vaccinate much against smallpox anymore, but when they did, they would take this cowpox virus and they would scratch it into someone, usually in their shoulder or their back. You'd see they'd get a little sore after a certain number of days, but they wouldn't really get sick. They certainly wouldn't get smallpox because it wasn't the smallpox virus. It was a related virus in the same genus, Vaccinia, as smallpox. Okay, but it resulted in their immunity against smallpox. So this was aggressively pursued throughout the world. Vaccinations were given starting in the 60s. You can see we had a lot of cases, of smallpox here, or a lot of countries reporting smallpox here, and that began to go down worldwide. We had fewer and fewer countries reporting smallpox till the 70s. It was really just one or two. And that was because we essentially eradicated smallpox from the wild. If a virus were living, so if the smallpox virus were a living thing, we would say that it was extinct. Okay, nowhere was it found in the world, and people were no longer getting smallpox. So because of that, they stopped giving routine vaccinations to the general public against smallpox, because with all drugs and all vaccines, there's a small risk of some kind of complication. And it was very small, but nonetheless, why risk even a small complication when there's zero risk of getting smallpox because it's now eradicated, extinct? So they quit giving it. But there are those that are concerned. We have an entire population of people now that are no longer vaccinated against smallpox. I imagine none of you in here have been vaccinated against it. The only ones that probably would be were those that are in active duty in the military, because there does still exist some smallpox virus out there kept in cold storage in military facilities, certainly in the United States and probably Russia and China, and we don't even know all of the countries, or someone probably knows, but I don't. And there are those concerns that as long as this virus is in storage somewhere, that it could be released as a weapon at some point. So this continues to be a concern we have. Now, but what it did do was smallpox provided, the smallpox vaccine provided the model for which we have used, or we've made other vaccinations. So the way a vaccine works in general principle is that if you expose a person to a related foreign protein, then what's going to happen is your body's going to go through this full immune system response. You remember the one, this flow chart that we've seen so many times now. And as it goes through that response, it's going to be left with memory cells, these memory B and memory T cells. That's what actually is going to provide the immunity against the disease. Now, the key thing to understand about how vaccines work is that you're not actually infecting someone with the disease itself. That would be just giving someone the disease. What you're doing is you're infecting them with a related thing, something that's going to sort of trick your body into responding as if it were infected with the real thing. But it's not the real thing. It may be weakened to such extent where the protein code is similar, and therefore your body goes through the same response as you see here, but yet the internal parts of the virus that would be dangerous to a person have been weakened or removed entirely, as with some vaccines. They're what we call dead vaccines. There's no part of the vaccine that can make you sick. That's how the flu vaccine is. So people that say that, oh, every time I get the flu vaccine, I get the flu. Well, that's just not true. It's not possible because there's nothing in the vaccine that can make you sick. Now, what can happen is you can have a small immune response, and in fact, that's what you want to have happen, right? Because you want your immune system to kind of go through this process in order to develop these memory B and T cells, because that's what's going to actually be your immunity against the disease in the end. So, now, vaccines don't always work as like a one-shot kind of thing. Sometimes you have to go through and have multiple inoculations. These are what we call booster shots, but they're not just for kids. I mean, these are the ones that you might be familiar with from your childhood, though I'm quite sure you don't remember all of them. Even as a parent actively immunizing my child today, I don't remember and wouldn't know the order to do all these. That's one of the reasons it's important to just sort of trust your doctor and follow the policies and procedures they have, because you don't want to miss any of these things, because if you miss a booster shot, then you can have gaps in coverage and you can get the disease. It's very common that people that miss a booster shot end up getting this disease, in part because they feel like they're protected, but they're really not. And like I said, this is not just for children. Adults here also need certain booster shots. The most common would be tetanus. Every 10 years you need a tetanus shot, and along with that they usually also will vaccinate for diphtheria, because that also only lasts about 10 years. The ones we're most familiar with would be, of course, flu, and those we need annually. Not so much because the vaccine quits working, but because the flu virus, the different flu viruses that you would be exposed to change kind of from year to year, and so you have to keep on top of that. And that's why this past year, you may not realize this, a lot of people had the flu. I had the flu, my family had the flu, we all were vaccinated, we still got it. It's because the vaccine that we got and that everyone got turned out not to cover many of the strains that turned out to be so widespread, because it's always a guessing game. The year before they release the vaccine, they look at the strains of the flu virus that are going around and they try to guess what it's going to be next year. Sometimes they do pretty well, and sometimes they don't. Another one that's important is going to be for pertussis, whooping cough. Not so much because adults are at risk, but because children that those adults may be around are at risk, because young children are quite susceptible to pertussis, and it can be a very bad thing. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So let's talk in general how these booster shots work. So if you look here at the beginning, this time 0, this would be the point at which you were given the first shot, the first booster shot. You were exposed to this antigen. The antigen is the thing in the booster shot, the vaccine, that is going to trigger your immune system response. And the way it triggers is it causes your immune system to produce more antibodies. Remember, those B cells are producing those antibodies. And they get to a certain concentration here after the first exposure, after a couple weeks. It's moderate, but not really high and not lasting. You see that it continues to go down, starts to go down. If you were to leave it and not get another booster shot, this would go all the way down back to 0, and it'd be as though after 6-7 weeks you had never been vaccinated. So what they do is they try to time it. As your antibody levels are going down here, they hit you with another booster shot at, say, 5 weeks. Well, then it's going to cause your body to even faster produce those antibodies and to a higher level. But what's more critical is after this second shot, and with some boosters it takes 2 or 3, you eventually get this tapering off where you're left with a residual number of these antibodies. That's what's going to provide you with the immunity against this particular disease. All right, we're going to skip these clicker questions since this is a video. All right, so in your article that you read here, they talk quite a bit about vaccination rates. And what you should know is that most children are completely vaccinated here in the United States. 3/4 of children have all of their shots. And even more significantly than that, that the 23% that are not technically fully vaccinated, well, they've had most of them. So there's just little gaps here and there. It's really a very small percent, only 2 to 3%, that just don't vaccinate at all. So even though there's a very tiny percent of parents that don't vaccinate their children, they tend to be a very vocal group. And that's one of the things that has caused us problems that will come up here in just a bit. And take with that what's happened with pertussis. So here's a disease that used to be a terrible problem. Many people would have pertussis here, in the 30s, 40s, and all. And this was a devastating disease for young children. Could cause death, and in those that it didn't, it usually caused some kind of lung damage. It got to a point where the number of cases of pertussis was essentially 0. All through the 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s, it was virtually nothing. That created a sense of complacency, okay? And when you couple that with the fact that you need booster shots to this, that complacency led to an uptick in the number of cases here. And this was a big jump, and it got a lot of people's attention. And what's so serious about this is that adults may just have a bad cough that causes them problems, but a child, especially an infant that gets this, can die from it. So it's very important that if you're going to be around small children, that you make sure that your booster shots against pertussis are up to date. You can see this is a slightly different way of looking at this. 2 graphs superimposed. So here's the number of cases. In this case, this is whooping cough, and I believe this was done in England. You can see it takes place through a number of years here. Number of cases goes way down here. Vaccination coverage was up high. As long as you keep it high in the 80s or so, you have very few number of cases. But when that coverage went down, because there was a sense of complacency, fewer people got the vaccine, coverage was only 40–50%, you see an uptick in the number of cases. Well, that got people's attention. They began to be vaccinated again, you see. The coverage rate went back up over 80%, and the number of cases went down, and that's kind of where it has stayed. And that is why it's so important that you have enough people vaccinated. There's always going to be some people that can't get vaccines because of underlying medical problems, and their only protection is for the rest of us to be vaccinated, because if there's a large enough group of unvaccinated people, that creates a population of people for the disease to spread among. And that's why we see these outbreaks that pop up here and there. You heard recently about measles in Disneyland. Well, it's because we had enough people not being vaccinated in that area that this was able to begin again. We thought measles was essentially eradicated, similar to smallpox, but clearly not. So you can't ever let your guard down, because these vaccines absolutely save lives. Countless lives here would be lost, to people dying from diseases that we just aren't accustomed to people dying from anymore because they're so well vaccinated, not to mention the savings to the medical community. So just sort of to illustrate this point, show you that I vaccinate my own daughter here. This was her at 6 months old here. She loves to watch this video now as a 6-year-old. You can see she has no idea what's going on here.
Oh, I don't have my name tag on. I'm sorry. Sorry. I need to get that on. I know how to do your shots last time. You had me mad at me. Oh, that's right. You did. I know. I won't be here for your 9 months, though. So. No. She'll be for her own little boy. I might be in here getting my kids shot. All right, pumpkins.
What a tough girl. Not a problem, right? Kind of like, what's going on? Now this one hurts a little more because it's a thicker vaccine. Oh, let's hit her quick before she knows what's going on here. And the last one. Got to start breathing here.
It's all over. All done.
Poor thing. But as you can see, she was fine 30 seconds later. She's like, whew, I don't know what hit me. I think it was harder on Mom than her. So then, a couple years ago, we decided to do a reprise here. She's been so into those videos for so long, so we decided to video her 4-year vaccinations. Now, the thing is, though, she didn't want me to actually video her because she was afraid she might cry, and she's very much aware that, I teach students at TCU, and she, thinks that she's my big helper here, and so she wants to help you all here to learn about vaccinations, but she's a little embarrassed for you to see her cry. So I didn't actually video her getting her vaccinations, but she has a word for you. Here it is. Oh, let me see. I didn't click play. Let me try play here. All right. Laura, what are you going to have done today?
I am going to give us 4 shots.
Can you show me where you're going to get them? Yeah. Are you excited about getting shots?
No.
No, but you're going to be brave?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll take another video afterwards. We'll see how you do, okay? She asked, can I see the video? She's very interested in her video. So here's the after effect. She looks kind of high or drunk or something. Those lollipops, man, they'll fix anything. So, alright. When she got home, she decided that, Dora needed some vaccinations too. She got 16. It was a rough day for Dora here. But Alara had a pretty good day. She kind of liked these sick days to be home, so we had a good time. Alright, so we're going to again skip these clicker questions. Let's talk a little bit about polio. Okay, polio is a little different, although it is still caused by a virus, but it infects nerve cells. Okay, we talked about how different microbes will infect different cells, and therefore affects how it's spread, how it affects you, etc. So polio will affect these nerve cells, and it can result in people being paralyzed. Not everyone. Only about 1 out of every 200 people that get polio will end up being paralyzed. But the other 199 out of 200 can spread this disease. And so this was one of the things that was so serious about this disease. A lot of people were spreading it and they didn't know they had it because they weren't actually ending up getting paralyzed from it. So it caused a lot of fearfulness when these outbreaks would occur. It usually affect children, and it very often the outbreaks would occur in the summertime. In fact, as an interesting example of correlation and causation and how you can't connect the two, there were some that would, use as an illustration the absurdity of saying that polio was caused by eating ice cream, because every time there was an increase in ice cream sales, you saw an increase in polio cases. Well, it turned out that it was because the polio cases were in the summer. And the reason they were in the summer was because they were being spread by swimming pools, because they were, spreading, fecal material. You don't like to think about that, but it spreads in a pool unless the pool is well chlorinated, etc. And many of them weren't back then. And so people were picking up polio in these pools. When they figured this out, public swimming went way down for a while here. But you can see that polio has not been an issue here in the United States for a very long time, since the 70s. And that's because we have not just one, but two good vaccines against it. Now you see, these illustrate both major types of vaccines that we have. The Salk vaccine is made of killed polio viruses, meaning that there's no part of that vaccine that can give you polio, because the part that could be dangerous, what we call the virulent part, has been removed. Okay, but it does protect you against polio, keeps you from becoming paralyzed. However, you could still carry it and spread it. That's where the Sabin vaccine comes in. It has a weakened version of the polio virus. So it's still an active virus, it's live, but it's not the full polio virus. So it sort of works your immune system a little harder. It's going to protect you not only from getting polio, but even from being able to carry and spread it to someone else. So in a sense, it's a much more effective vaccine. However, in very, very rare cases, you can actually see a mutation of this virus back into the fully virulent form, and that person could get polio. So we sort of do a combination of the two now to make sure that no one is getting this, and no one's at risk of getting polio from this. And even though there's a theoretical risk, it's very, very small, just a few out of millions, so virtually zero. You can see that we have just about eradicated polio. We had to actually blow up the graph here to even see any resolution because it's so close to zero, which is good. It only occurs in a few countries, and this was in 2010, and I'm happy to say that as of now, we are really close. There's just a few countries that are still seeing polio, so it really has been a success story. Alright, but that success was almost thwarted about 10-15 years ago because of what we now know was a completely inappropriate publication. But let's talk more about that. So what's the controversy to begin with? Well, it turns out that there were some people that began to float this idea that that vaccines could cause autism. Well, there's some basis for that, because as I mentioned, with polio, because it's a live virus in there, in a few cases, you could have this virus mutate back into a form that could cause trouble. But you can see, if you look close at that article, 99.99996 of the cases, it doesn't do that. So we're talking about almost minuscule, but it's there. And so people get fearful, understandably. If you're the one that's affected by it, well, then it really is meaningful and matters to you. Now, what made this really bad was in 1998, there was a doctor, Andrew Walker, that published a story, a news report, not a news report, but a research paper in a very prestigious peer-reviewed journal called The Lancet, and it still is. And this slipped through. This was one of those cases where peer review did not catch this. In this article, he suggested that the vaccine for MMR, which is for measles, mumps, and rubella, might be associated with autism. Now, you should know a little bit more about autism, and we'll come back to that study. It's technically better referred to as autism spectrum disorder because there's a wide range of things that we sometimes mistakenly just all call autism. Okay, and these symptoms usually occur when children are pretty young, as they're beginning to communicate and things. We have no idea really what causes it. What we do know is that about 1% of children in the United States will develop autism. And that's a big number, especially when you consider that in 1980 it was only 1 out of 5,000. So whatever is causing this, and we don't know what it is still a significant thing. So people said, well, what if it's mercury? Because you remember from mercury in the teratogens lab that it can cause neurological damage. But it turns out that, and mercury was used for a while as a preservative. It keeps fungus from growing, so that way they can create lots of these vaccines, transport them across the world, and they won't, spoil. But there was a very tiny amount of mercury even when it was in it, much less so than what you might even get in just a simple can of tuna. Okay, so not enough mercury to cause any trouble in the first place. But even still, they got rid of even that. They stopped using that in the early 90s, and yet even since then, the autism rate has just continued to go up. So there's absolutely no connection, and never has been. There's no scientific connection, and never has been, that links mercury exposure and autism. So what about this story that was in the Lancet? What's the deal with that? Well, okay, it turns out that this author was using some very questionable practices. He was not, using the good two-group experimental design that we've talked about, and in addition to that, we found out he was heavily funded and supported by these advocacy groups that were trying to promote this idea that autism was caused by mercury in vaccinations, and so they had a real agenda, and he had a real financial stake in this. Now, since then, there have been many studies, and none of this has been able to back up anything he said, because it wasn't done properly in the first place. So there's absolutely never been any scientific connection there. But things last a long time in people's memories, and that's one of the scary negative things about the internet. Is that when you start saying things, especially things that tug on your heartstrings or have to do with fearfulness, then people put a lot of stock in that. And so it's been hard to sort of debunk this myth, but actually it gives me some confidence in the scientific process in general, because we said all along that's the whole value of peer review and of science as a process, that it's self-correcting. And in fact it did. Now it took 10-15 years, but keep in mind that in the scheme of science as a bigger thing, that's not that long. There's going to be a point when we look back in history, and this will be a little blip on the radar. But it nonetheless was a very good lesson for us. And it's one of the reasons I want you to understand how to find good, reliable sources on the internet, because you will be able to find something on the internet that backs up anything you can imagine. And these are not from, bad people. I mean, these are well-meaning people, and usually well-educated people, that they simply care about their children, and their children may have autism, and they're looking for answers, and you can't fault them for that. And so this makes this a very sensitive, topic. But the bottom line that we do know is that vaccines do save lives. The risks of these diseases are so much greater than the risk of the vaccine itself. Because remember, even taking something like aspirin or Tylenol, there's a risk that you will have a complication from that very, simple drug. Well, the same is true for vaccines. There's a tiny risk, but most of the time those risks are well understood. People know if they're allergic to something like eggs, because that's one of the big risks, so they know not to get the vaccine. They know if they have certain underlying medical conditions that would make it dangerous for them to get a vaccine, and so they don't get the vaccine. It's very rare that someone has one of these really negative side effects because of it. And it's not rare for people to get these diseases. So we're much better off preventing these diseases with the vaccines than we are to sort of take, people say, well, I just want to take a chance on the vaccine. Chickenpox isn't going to kill them. Well, probably not, but it's a lot more likely to kill them than the vaccine is. And that's even more true for some of these other much more dangerous diseases. So it's really not worth the risk. So next we speak will be HIV and AIDS.